Your cat is curled up on the couch, immaculate in its apathy. Your dog snores like a steamed dumpling in a steam room. They look peaceful, invulnerable even, and it's not just their nap schedule. Across town halls and sleepy county courthouses, you'll find a patchwork of strange laws and ordinances that, when you stack them up, make it look like animals enjoy a kind of VIP treatment. Why does your pet seem safer than most people? Because somewhere, some bureaucrat wrote rules that treat animals as entities worth protecting, sometimes thoughtfully, sometimes absurdly, and those rules have a stubborn way of staying on the books. That sounds like an exaggeration until you picture an actual scene. An elephant feeding a parking meter while its handler curses a parking warden, a donkey banned from steeping in a bathtub, a tourist fined for waking a bear to get a selfie, a bored municipal code that explicitly forbids handing your schnauzer a lit cigar. These are real images, reported ordinances, and old local stories, not necessarily enforced with SWAT teams and subpoenas, but present as formal language in statutes and municipal codes. Put a few dozen of them together, and the pattern stops being random. It starts to look like a set of motives: liability avoidance, civic branding, weird local history, and plain legal inertia. Those motives mean animals are frequently singled out for special protection, classification, or regulation, while people, by contrast, often find themselves subject to nitpicky, moralistic, or downright random restrictions. Stick with me. I'll walk you through a curated parade of the oddest animal-focused statutes, then show you the human laws that make their special treatment look especially strange. I'll try to keep the outrage optional and the amusement mandatory. If this is hitting a nerve, or if your pet has a better resume than you do, drop their name in the comments now. I want to hear which four-legged creature in your life enjoys better legislative coverage than your neighbors. Let's start with the animals. These examples are short, visual, and each comes with a little likely origin story. Remember, most of these read as ordinances or on-the-books curiosities. Some are rooted in odd episodes, some grew from tourism, and some are legal fossils nobody bothered to dig up and bury. First, imagine a donkey and a bathtub. The ordinance in question is often told as an Arizona curiosity, a city code that bans donkeys from sleeping in a bathtub. The image itself is irresistible, a stubborn beast lodged in porcelain, the town responding with municipal law. The backstory, according to local accounts, usually points to a single event. A donkey took a napsicle in someone's tub, the tub cracked, neighbors sued, and somebody in City Hall, probably sleepwalking through the zoning committee, drafted a rule. Whether anyone enforces it today is beside the point. The law is precise enough to make the donkey saga feel, at least on paper, litigated and settled. The real takeaway is that one odd accident plus a few frightened property owners can harden into a rule that protects, or at least regulates, animal behavior in a very specific way. Next, picture a circus elephant trying to find parking downtown. There's an oft-repeated line in municipal folklore, an ordinance that treats elephants like vehicles when it comes to parking meters. The visual sells itself: a pachyderm nudging a meter with its trunk, a ringmaster shoving quarters into the slot. Historically, these laws are rooted in moments when traveling shows and circuses or a major form of entertainment. Towns wanted to be hospitable, but also wanted their streets orderly. So they wrote rules that recognized big animals as occupying space and subject to municipal controls. It's practical if you imagine the street grid in the age before giant trailers and modern logistics. It's ridiculous if you imagine paying a ticket while your elephant eats your parking receipt. Either way, the point is that animals were explicitly accounted for in local regulation. Then there's the "don't wake the bear" rule, often found in park regulations or state wildlife guidance. Some Alaska parks reportedly have language discouraging people from intentionally disturbing a sleeping bear, and not merely as a wildlife preservation primitive. These rules are as much about human safety and liability as they are about protecting ursine dignity.
Tourists love the adrenaline of a close-up wild animal shot. Towns and park services hate the ambulance bill and the lawsuit. So you get rules that read like common sense: don't poke sleeping bears. Framing the law this way protects both the bear and the person who would otherwise become a statistic and a headline. You might also encounter statutes that forbid giving a lit cigar to a pet. This reads like the punchline of a sketch: no person shall give a dog, cat, or other animal a lidded cigar or cigarette. But these laws are likely reactions to specific cruelties or ill-advised stunts, and they send a message. Even in places where animal cruelty statutes already exist, local ordinances sometimes enumerate particular acts to close loopholes or to make enforcement straightforward for animal control officers and judges. The result is a formal, black-and-white sentence that treats certain forms of mistreatment as worthy of explicit mention. Arizona crops up again in the historical list because of the Army camel experiment in the 1850s. When the U.S. Army shipped camels out west to test them as pack animals, towns adapted in strange ways, and some local regulations reflected these oddities.
That led to a handful of laws and traditions that treat camels as a recognized local presence, a real-world reminder that a government's decision, even if short-lived, can leave ripples in municipal code. If a town once had camels drifting through its streets, it makes sense, historically speaking, to write them into the law books. And then there are the creative classifications, places where laws single out animals for special status, sometimes for symbolic reasons. One town once passed an ordinance that, more or less jokingly, made it illegal to harass a cryptid, a tongue-in-cheek nod to local folklore about Bigfoot. The law reads like civic theater. It's a marketing flourish, a wink to tourists, and also a way to regulate behavior in a branded way. The technical effect is odd. Animals or animal-like creatures get named in a legal code where people might not. It's both protection and postcard. Each of these examples shares something: a specificity that applies to non-human subjects and a story that connects the ability to regulate animals to a local concern, whether that's a lawsuit, a tourist attraction, a historical quirk, or community reputation. The specificity is important. Vague laws are hard to enforce, but a very specific rule, no donkeys in bathtubs, gives enforcers a line to point at when someone complains. That clarity can, paradoxically, become a form of protection for the animal because it acknowledges and anticipates the animal's presence in civic life. Now, let's swing the frame to humans and look at what people are often made to live under. The contrast amplifies the thesis. While animals get bespoke rules, humans sometimes end up with petty, moralistic, or strangely bureaucratic constraints. Which is to say, your neighbor is not necessarily safe, they're merely subject to a different, and often less dignified brand of law. Take the famous high heel ordinance in a California coastal town. A municipal code reportedly required women to obtain a permit to wear high heels over 2 inches on certain streets. The origin story offered to explain the rule was oddly municipal. The city worried about liability from people tripping on uneven sidewalks. Rather than fix the sidewalks, the usual engineering solution, the town regulated footwear. From a liability standpoint, it's a quirky attempt to manage risk by regulating behavior. From a dignity standpoint, it's an extraordinary priority swap. Better to license stilettos than to level a sidewalk. Then there are laws that sound like they were written by a bored moralist with a thesaurus. In some places, it's illegal to sing off-key in public. In others, public kissing is timed, restricted, or specifically outlawed for men with mustaches. These laws read like social theater. They encode community standards as formal prohibitions, but the practical effect is not protection in the way animal ordinances often claim to be. Instead, they police taste, manners, and public decency, things humans can be judged for, while animals are often sheltered by rules meant to avoid lawsuits or to preserve a town's quaint image. There are also regulations that manage private, intimate behaviors, like noise rules about snoring or overly loud bedrooms, framed as public nuisances. Humans, in these instances, are subject to code enforcement that treats personal foibles as civic violations. It's less about bodily protection and more about maintaining a particular quality of life standard the town defines. The contrast is stark. An ordinance will tell you not to wake a bear and will balk at your muffled chainsaw serenade. These human-targeted laws highlight a central irony. Municipalities will sometimes expend more legislative energy specifying the allowable interactions with animals than resolving recurring human safety issues or structural issues. If you think that's a critique of local government priorities, you'd be right, in a way, but it's also a reflection of what motivates lawmaking at the micro level. So why does this pattern emerge? There are four engines that, when they run together, often produce laws that make animals appear safer than people. Each engine has its own logic and examples. Together, they explain the quilt of local codes we're staring at. First, liability avoidance. This is the boring, bureaucratic engine, but the most powerful. Courts and insurers have a way of turning one accident into a flood of claims. Governments and property owners respond by writing rules that absolve them in the court of municipal code from future blame. For example, regulating high heels is less glorious than fixing uneven sidewalks, but it's cheaper in the immediate municipal budget. Lawmakers can write a rule to minimize ambiguous liability. Similarly, explicit prohibitions on giving animals dangerous items or of interacting with sleeping wildlife can be framed to prevent predictable lawsuits. If you can point to a statute that says "don't do X," then when something goes wrong, the legal argument becomes simpler. That clarity protects property owners and municipalities, and, incidentally, the animals themselves, since the rule reduces the chance they'll be coaxed into harmful situations. Second, tourism and civic branding. Towns are products. They sell festivals, quirks, and memorable signs. A chicken statue or a municipal law about the local mascot can be a PR move. Gainesville's poultry-related ordinances or a coastal town's pachyderm parade are gestures toward identity. When a place brands itself around an animal, that animal's presence in code can become part of the marketing. Rules that protect, celebrate, or at least regulate the animal are also rules that protect the town's image. Tourists come for the oddity, and the oddity survives because it benefits local chambers of commerce. Third, one-off historical reasons. This is where the donkey in the bathtub and the army camels fit. A single episode, an accident, an experiment, a traveling troupe, can produce a localized change in behavior, and then the local law gets written to account for that behavior. Once it's written, it doesn't necessarily go away. Successive officials inherit the ordinance, and the memory of the original incident recedes into municipal lore. The ordinance doesn't vanish because removing it requires effort and political will that rarely align with the cost of simply leaving it alone. Over time, what started as a practical fix becomes an odd, preserved patch of local law. Fourth, legal inertia and administrative sloth. Repealing laws is work. It requires motions, votes, hearings, and often the kind of political appetite that only arises when the law becomes a scandal or national news. Many of the examples we love to laugh at survive precisely because nobody has prioritized the cleanup. An ordinance can become a joke on a t-shirt, a local curiosity, and a tourist snapshot, and that cultural affection makes the law less likely to be repealed. This inertia preserves both the quirks and the sense that animals have a line in the code that people do not. Put these engines together and you get a civic ecosystem where animals are often treated as clear categories. They are physically distinct, easy to describe, and politically safe to protect. Regulating an animal costs little in controversy. Who argues in favor of the person who wants to give a dog a lit cigar? Restricting human behaviors, by contrast, touches on rights, dignity, taste, and politics. That asymmetry is part of why animals frequently enjoy specific protections in municipal language. It's politically low risk, administratively simple, and often framed as common sense. But let's not romanticize all of these laws. Some of them are compassionate, others are pragmatic, and a subset are simply weird gestures rooted in an earlier era's priorities. The moral gray area is part of the point. Laws that read like protection can also be instruments of negligence by proxy. Regulate footwear instead of repairing sidewalks, and you've prioritized paperwork over people's safety. Pass a high-profile animal ordinance as a PR stunt, and you've turned civic identity into folklore scaffolding. So the question isn't merely whether animals are safer, it's whether the legal attention they receive is a faithful proxy for communal care. Before we go deeper into motive and effect, let's linger on a few more animal statutes that are both illustrative and deliciously specific. These are the kinds of rules that make you do a double take. They're short, concrete, and evocative, and they help us test the thesis with real-world oddities. There's a regulation on the books somewhere that explicitly forbids giving your dog a lit cigar. We've mentioned it, but let's unpack why listing such an act matters. Animal cruelty statutes tend to be broad. They prohibit neglect, intentional harm, and malicious behavior. But a targeted rule that calls out "no one shall give an animal a burning tobacco product" makes enforcement blunt and unambiguous. It removes interpretive wiggle room and helps animal control officers write a citation rather than file a complaint that could be dismissed as a neighborly disagreement. In practice, this protects the animal by lowering the bar to intervention. Whether the law is enforced with a ticket or simply provides a clear standard for condemnation, it places the animal in a protected class, defined by a specific, recognizably dangerous act. Compare that to a neighbor's snoring, which is often only a nuisance complaint unless someone escalates. Animal protection gets bright-line rules, human annoyances get discretionary enforcement, and frequently compassion fatigue. The structural difference explains a lot about the safer sense. Here's a place that reportedly has an ordinance aimed at geese. You can't feed them bread in certain parks, and people are fined for doing so. On the surface, that sounds like a petty restriction, but the law actually serves a dual purpose. It reduces disease transmission among birds, and it prevents the formation of aggressive, park-hogging flocks that become public hazards. The rule is framed as gentle stewardship of wildlife, but it's also a very direct public health and liability move. Again, the interesting part is not the content of the rule, it's that the rule makes animals the subject of direct behavioral governance in a way many human nuisances are not. Then there's the Mad Lib's humor of laws that treat exotic animals like ordinary infrastructure. The elephant pays for parking idea fits within a broader pattern where animals of a certain size or utility are folded into existing bureaucratic categories. Because municipal codes are full of forms and fees, the easiest place to put a new regulation is often to adapt existing frameworks. In this case, treating an elephant as a vehicle occupying a meter. Practical? In historical context, yes. Ridiculous? Also yes. And that contradiction reveals how administrative convenience can end up looking like preferential attention. And the camels. The U.S. Army's mid-19th century camel experiment left literal tracks in the Southwest. Towns that hosted camels adjusted, some ordinances reflected the animal's presence, and some local customs absorbed it. Those laws are testimony to the fact that when a community's lived reality includes particular non-human residents, lawmakers will write rules to fit. That legal recognition can feel like protection, or it can feel like bureaucratic acceptance, but either way, it positions animals within the legal order in a way many people never occupy. Having cataloged examples and sketched the big drivers, we now step toward the heart of the matter: how these features interact to produce what we might call the pet-safe illusion.
That phrase is useful because it acknowledges two things at once. First, there is a real legal pattern where animals receive explicit rules that shield, classify, or otherwise regulate their interaction with us. Second, the pattern can create an illusion, a sense that animals are safer in a moral or structural way than humans.
The law invests in animals because doing so reduces liability, enhances tourism, preserves a historical anecdote, or is simply a low-cost governance move. But a law that explicitly forbids a bad act is not the same as a society that prioritizes animal welfare comprehensively. It's possible, indeed common, that a town can have an ordinance protecting a single romanticized animal behavior and still lack robust animal control funding, shelters, or cruelty prosecution. The legal text is a signal, but it's not a full account. So what happens when these signals are taken together? The municipal patchwork sends mixed messages that benefit animals in specific ways. An elephant might be covered by a parking rule, a dog by a prohibition on cigars, and a bear by a don't wake clause. Those are instances where the legal system acknowledges non-human vulnerability, clarifies acceptable human behavior, and sets an enforcement baseline, even if the baseline is only symbolic. People, by contrast, are often treated as messy legal subjects. Their behavior is policed in fine-grained ways, their safety is traded off against budgetary constraints, and their dignity can be regulated into awkward ordinances. The net effect is a social script where pets, in certain legal moments, are afforded clearer boundaries and protections than the average person. We're already halfway to the hard examples, the ones that will make you laugh first and then itch with that slow, civil critic discomfort. But before we get there, let me pull one thread a little further. Consider the interplay between tourism and legal inertia. A town that makes a spectacle of an animal will codify that spectacle to preserve it for visitors. Once codified, the spectacle becomes tradition, and tradition becomes a local asset that civic actors have an interest in protecting. To eliminate the ordinance would be to risk losing a piece of identity, therefore it stays. The law persists partly because it is profitable as a cultural artifact. This long-term protection by ordinance is subtle. It's not the same as a municipality hiring a round-the-clock animal counselor. Instead, it creates snapshots of protection for specific behaviors or creatures, precisely the kind of legal attention that lends an impression animals here are taken care of. That impression can be real, but it's often uneven and particularized. We're close to the end of this segment, and this is where the story should pause to collect itself. We've seen the quirky laws, and we've started to see why they exist.
We've traced 4 drivers that make animals appear safer on paper: liability management, tourism and branding, historical one-offs, and bureaucratic inertia. We've compared these to the peculiar laws that often govern human behavior, and we've observed an asymmetry that's less about kindness and more about pragmatism, optics, and administrative convenience. What remains is the most persuasive evidence, a pair of emblematic statutes that, when taken together, say everything about the phenomenon. One of them is the elephant and parking meter anecdote, a rule that compresses history, commerce, and absurdity into a single image. The other is the donkey and bathtub ordinance, a law that compresses accident, neighborly grievance, and legal specificity into a single line item. If you imagine these 2 rules side by side, you can see the thesis in high relief. The law will, in different ways, protect the pachyder's spot in the street while delegating human comfort and dignity to the slow churn of public works budgets and social norms. But there's another layer that we haven't fully unfolded yet: enforcement, symbolism, and the moral psychology of municipal lawmaking. It's one thing to write a rule, it's another to enforce it consistently. Some laws exist primarily as deterrents. Others are actively enforced when a high-profile incident pushes them into the headlines. Still others are performative, written for the press release and never intended to be wielded like a ticket book. The difference between protection by code and protection in practice is enormous, and that tension is where the story deepens. We will come back to enforcement patterns and to the most telling examples in a moment. There's one final conceptual pivot to make before we pause: the symbolic capital of animals in law.
When a town names an animal in its code, it confers a kind of symbolic personhood, not legal personhood in the heavy sense, but a recognition that this non-human presence matters. That symbolic recognition is useful. It helps communities to find themselves, gives local leaders a quick way to show responsiveness, and provides the raw material for tourism marketing. Yet symbolic recognition is also fragile. It can be a prop for a photo op rather than the foundation for a comprehensive ethic of care. So, where does that leave us? With a stack of funny, odd, and strangely instructive examples, with a framework of 4 drivers that explain why animals often sit in the protected center of municipal attention, and with an emerging paradox. Animals sometimes get better, clearer legal parameters than people, but those parameters are frequently symbolic, piecemeal, and shaped by motives that are not purely compassionate. We're about to drill down into enforcement patterns and the 2 emblematic statutes that best evidence the thesis.
We'll walk through a hypothetical enforcement scene for an elephant parking ticket, then reconstruct the likely municipal reaction to a donkey bathtub emergency, and use both to test whether written protection translates into meaningful safety. We'll look at counterexamples and at cases where human-focused investment actually outpaces animal-focused symbolism. And yes, we'll return to the ethical question. Is it better to have an ordinance that names an animal explicitly, or to have systems that prevent harm across the board regardless of species? But before we jump into the dramatized enforcement scenes and the forensic unpeeling of municipal motives, take a breath and think about your own town. Has it ever passed a law that made you do a double take? Is there an animal your community treats like a mascot and a saint? If so, drop that animal's name in the comments and tell us whether that law was more about safety, tourism, or simply an old story that never died. Your example might be the single local anecdote that helps prove or complicate the pattern we're exploring. Now, let's step into one of those emblematic scenes. Late afternoon, a Main Street meter, an elephant whose job is entertainment, but whose presence turns the parking rules into a surreal quiz about municipal category theory. The handler fumbles for quarters, a tourist films, and a clerk on the sidewalk emerges with a ticket book and a puzzled expression. How would the law apply? Who decides whether the pachyderm is a vehicle, a transient exhibit, or an exception worthy of a press release? That question opens a broader set of issues about how legal categories are created, the role of administrators in interpreting codes, and the performative force of a ticket when it lands on an elephant's handler rather than on a person. And then there's the bathtub. Picture the neighbor who discovers a recessed, broken tub with a very tired donkey inside. The property owner is mad about the damage. The donkey appears unharmed. A crowd gathers. Someone calls the city. Who writes the ordinance that says no donkeys in bathtubs, and why? Was it a practical fix for an expensive plumbing problem, a moment of neighborly spite frozen into law, or an attempt to prevent a repeat performance? The specificity is telling. Laws that identify discrete animal behaviors are usually reactive, designed to solve one problem with one rule. We'll pick these narratives apart and then return to a broader synthesis, how liability, tourism, historical oddities, and inertia combine to create a legal landscape where pets, in very particular ways, have structural protections that many humans lack. The synthesis will culminate in a clear thesis and a brief, pithy recommendation for how towns might align their legal priorities if they truly care about safety over spectacle.
But for now, hold that tableau. The elephant at the meter, the donkey at the bathtub, the person who is legally prohibited from handing their pug a lit cigar. Those images are more than punchlines. They are evidence. They are little legal fossils that, taken together, reveal priorities. And those priorities say something about the cultural logic of lawmaking in small towns and big counties. Animals are often simpler regulatory objects, making them easier to legislate for.
whereas human needs are complex, frequently politicized, and thus harder to convert into quick municipal action. We'll take all of that apart next. First, we'll follow an actual enforcement chain for an animal ordinance, from complaint to citation to press release, and see where the alleged protection stops and performative governance begins. Then we'll map the other axis, resources. Does the presence of an ordinance correlate with budgetary support for animal welfare, or is it mostly a piece of symbolic text? Those are the questions that determine whether a pet is genuinely safer or merely better represented on paper. Stay with the thread. We're about to move from catalog to microscope. Imagine the call that kicks the whole thing off. Someone spots an elephant at a Main Street meter and dials 311 more out of confusion than outrage. Or a neighbor texts the mayor a photo of a donkey lodged in a bathtub, captioned with equal parts horror and glee. From that moment on, the municipal machinery hums in very human ways. Paperwork, memos, a sergeant who laughs until the clerk produces the ordinance number. That procedural choreography is important because it shows how an animal-focused rule becomes an actual enforced reality, or at least a theatrical one. Here's a typical enforcement chain, the one that turns a quirky piece of text into an actual civic event. First, the complaint. A person, usually worried or inconvenienced, asks the government to act. Second, triage. The call goes to an animal control officer, a parks ranger, or a general code enforcement employee. Third, an on-site inspection. The officer assesses safety risk, documents damage, and decides whether the scene violates a statute. Fourth, resolution. That might be a friendly warning, a written citation on the books, or a referral to a more serious prosecutor if cruelty is suspected. Fifth, follow-up. Sometimes there's a press release or a social media post, and the story becomes a small-town parable. What matters is not just that a law exists, but how the administrative apparatus around it operates. In towns with staffed, funded animal control units, an ordinance is more likely to function as a real tool. Complaints get logged, citations can be written, offenders are tracked, shelters may receive referrals. In places where animal protection is one part-time responsibility of a building inspector who also handles zoning permits, an ordinance is often performative, nice to point to during a tourist brochure photo op, less useful when an animal is actually in trouble. That gap between paper and practice is exactly where the pet-safe illusion lives. An ordinance that explicitly forbids giving a dog a burning cigar can be a brilliant enforcement shortcut. It removes ambiguity and lets an officer act decisively. But if the same town has no animal shelter, no trained responders, and no funding for spay and neuter programs, the ordinance's practical impact on animal welfare is limited. The law says no, but the budget says maybe. The result, a neat paragraph in the municipal code and a mantelpiece anecdote, precisely the combination that makes a pet feel safer on paper than a person feels in practice. Contrast that with human-centered problems, where the enforcement chain often looks messier and costlier. People file noise complaints about a neighbor's chronic snoring. Code enforcement sends a letter asking for quieter fans or better insulation. Maybe the city offers mediation. But fixing the structural cause, replacing thin walls, subsidizing mental health treatment, improving housing stock, requires sustained investment. It requires money, cross-department coordination, and political will. Passing an ordinance about animal conduct is cheap, but repairing sidewalks, building shelters, or funding substance abuse programs is expensive. That arithmetic shapes outcomes. There are places that buck the pattern, of course. Some municipalities pair quirky ordinances with substantive programs. A town that declares a rooster its mascot may also fund humane education and a well-run animal shelter. Those are the exceptions that complicate the narrative. Sometimes symbolic laws catalyze funding, grant opportunities or tourism dollars that get reinvested in real services, but often the sequence runs the other way. A cute ordinance is cheaper and faster than a capital campaign, so it happens first, and the rest, if it ever comes, lags. Let's dramatize two emblematic scenes so you can feel how the statutory text meets the messy reality. Scene 1. The elephant at the meter. A summer afternoon, a festival brings a small traveling circus downtown. The ringmaster parks his elephant in a prominent spot to pose for photos. A teenager tries to feed the animal popcorn. A local meter maid approaches, puzzled. She flips through her binder and finds the clause that nominally treats certain large animals as vehicles for parking purposes. The handler heaps quarters into the meter. The crowd laughs. Someone snaps a photo for the paper. The press office drafts a short, bemused statement. No ticket is issued. The internet gets a viral snapshot. The ordinance, in this case, served as a taxonomy, an administrative category to file an unusual event under, more than a tool of strict regulation. Now scene 2, the bathtub donkey. A property owner wakes up to a cracked porcelain basin and a very stubborn animal. Neighbors gather. Someone calls animal control and the building inspector. The inspector notes water damage, photos are taken, and the owner wants compensation. The city attorney locates a precise statute, no donkeys shall sleep in bathtubs, and writes a memo recommending a civil remedy for the damaged property. A council member brings the story to the next meeting as a curious anecdote and moves for a minor amendment clarifying responsibilities and similar future events. The law ends up functioning as a shorthand for assigning blame and managing expectations. It prevents a long litigation slog by establishing a community norm and a potential fine. Again, the ordinance did more to clear a bureaucratic path than to fundamentally improve the donkey's welfare. Both scenes illustrate a crucial point. Many animal ordinances exist not as expressions of pure compassion, but as bite-sized legal instruments designed to make otherwise messy disputes administratable. That makes them politically palatable and administratively useful, which explains why they survive. There's another psychological lever in play: anthropomorphism. People project human traits onto pets and charismatic megafauna. They call a dog part of the family. That emotional closeness makes animal-based regulations politically safe, even satisfying. Who can argue against forbidding someone from feeding bread to geese that will then clog a park fountain? Who speaks up for the person told to get a high heel permit because the sidewalk is uneven? The asymmetry of empathy nudges lawmakers to write laws that protect animals in very visible ways, while human-centered interventions, which might require uncomfortable budget conversations or political trade-offs, stall. Tourism and civic branding amplify the effect. A town that hosts an annual elephant parade or celebrates its camel history has an economic stake in maintaining the spectacle. Codifying rules about those animals guarantees the continuity of the event and gives the tourism board a line in a brochure. Those economic incentives make it rational to preserve an ordinance, even if the deeper welfare work is deferred. Legal inertia, meanwhile, is both a friend and an enemy. Once a law exists, it becomes a cultural artifact. It's part of the town's story. Repeal requires energy, a council hearing, public testimony, and political capital. Many odd ordinances survive because nobody cares enough to kill them. That survival can be harmless and whimsical, or it can be a way to avoid addressing underlying problems.
Regulate heels instead of fixing the sidewalk. Pass a ban on feeding geese but cut funding for parks maintenance. Write a lit cigar prohibition for pets while animal control budgets remain skeletal. The enforcement patterns we've described also shed light on who benefits. Animals benefit from clarity. A bright line rule against one particular cruelty is easy to enforce, easy to publicize, and low controversy. People, on the other hand, are complex legal objects. Civil liberties, property rights, public benefits, zoning disputes. The administrative overhead is higher, and the political cost of intervention is steeper. That difference in complexity is part of why animals sometimes appear better protected. But let's not pretend that this is only a comedy of errors. Sometimes these animal-centric rules have real protective effect. No-wake bear ordinances reduce dangerous interactions and likely avert injury. Anti-cruelty specifics can help prosecutors nail down abusive behaviors. Feeding bans can curb disease vectors. In those cases, the law functions as intended. It narrows behavior in ways that reduce harm. The tricky part is measuring the magnitude of that protection. Does a rule that forbids giving a dog a cigarette substantially lower rates of cruelty? Hard to say without data. Does it create a norm that makes intervention by bystanders more acceptable? That seems plausible. A town that explicitly labels a behavior as unacceptable invites enforcement and social censure in a way a vague statute does not. There's another dimension worth considering: political theater. Passing a headline-friendly animal law can be a way for a council to appear responsive without taking on structural reforms. A mayor can sign an ordinance banning the feeding of aggressive seagulls and feature it in a press release, while the root cause, overflowing dumpsters, inadequate waste collection, a lack of humane wildlife management, is unchanged. That's not always cynical. Sometimes councils act incrementally when budgets are tight. But it does create a symbolic economy where visible rules matter more than invisible systems. Where does that leave the average pet and the average person? Your cat curled on the couch benefits from municipal language more often than your neighbor benefits from structural investments, at least in certain jurisdictions. The law's willingness to identify and list animal-related offenses makes the boundaries around acceptable behavior clearer. Human misfortunes, by contrast, are frequently routed through policy domains, housing, health, labor, that are contested and expensive. So, if the legal landscape makes your pet feel safer, that safety is both real and partial. It's real because explicit statutes can prevent specific harms and make enforcement easier. It's partial because the presence of a law doesn't guarantee resources, enforcement capacity, or a broader ethic of care. A municipal code can forbid feeding geese, but still allow insufficient funding for the park staff, who would enforce that rule and clean up the consequences. There's also a civic choice inherent in this distribution of attention. Communities can decide whether they want to invest in comprehensive safety nets that cover humans and animals together, or whether they prefer to preserve picturesque rules that give the impression of protection. The latter choice tends to be easier in the short term and cheaper to enact. The former requires a sustained political commitment and money. To wrap this into a tight, persuasive point, the reason your pet feels safer than most people is not an accident. It's an outcome of administrative logic. Animals are easier to define, easier to regulate with bright lines, and less politically risky to protect symbolically. Municipalities face pressures, liability, branding, historical oddities, and sheer inertia that converge to make targeted animal statutes common. Where a problem involves a clear, describable act, don't wake the bear, don't give a dog a lit cigar, the law can act decisively. Where a problem involves systemic causes affecting people, the remedies are harder, costlier, and less likely to be solved by a single ordinance. Before we end, let's return to the two emblematic statutes one last time and see how they summarize the whole dynamic. The elephant at the meter roll compresses history, categorization, and bureaucratic convenience. It tells you that the town can and will make room for a spectacle, and that municipal codes will adapt to fit the visual economy of the place.
The donkey and the bathtub law compresses neighborly conflict, property damage, and reactive engineering into a tidy sentence. It tells you that a single bizarre incident can become a legal precedent if it creates a problem that demands a simple fix. Both statutes reveal a broader civic psychology. We codify what is visible, what can be described in a sentence, and what offers immediate political payoff. That's not necessarily malign. It's efficient governance at the micro level. But efficiency is not the same as justice or comprehensive safety. So what do we do with this observation? You might, as a neighbor or a voter, do something simple. Notice where your town's attention goes. Does it pass a parade-ready ordinance and then let maintenance budgets lag? Does it publish signage protecting a beloved mascot but fail to fund shelters or sidewalks? Those are the decisions that shape whether protection on paper leads to protection in life. And if you're a pet owner, take comfort in the peculiar protection your companion enjoys, but keep your expectations calibrated. A law named for your animal is a helpful shield in some moments, but it's not a universal safeguard. Real safety, whether for pets or people, happens when statutes line up with funding, training, and political will. Your pet's nap is still probably earned.
The law occasionally conspires in that nap by setting crisp behavioral boundaries, by giving animal control officers something clear to point to, and by preserving the civic theater that makes visiting the town memorable. Those things matter. They make it easier to protect a dog, a bear, or a parade elephant in snapshots. But remember, the next time you see a municipal code that feels like a love letter to animals, look at the line items in the budget too. The presence of a charming ordinance is not a guarantee of compassionate, well-funded infrastructure. It's a start, and sometimes a delightful one, but it's often more signpost than solution. If you've ever lived somewhere with a law that made you laugh and then think, something that protected an animal in a way that made you wonder about priorities, drop that story in the comments. Tell us which law you'd write if you could pass one absurd ordinance tomorrow. Would you ban squirrels from jaywalking or require llamas to wear name tags? And if you liked this little legal safari through municipal code, hit subscribe so we can keep digging up the odd laws that say a lot about who we choose to protect. After all, it's one thing for your pet to sleep like royalty. It's another for the rest of us to wake up and fix the sidewalks.